Yes, as David has said, we're one of the platforms to support high-value nutrition, and the team includes Dr. Sarah Jager and myself from Plant and Food, Dr. Denise Conroy from the University of Auckland, Professor Phil Bremner from the University of Otago, and Dr. Bill K. Blake from PricewaterhouseCoopers. The philosophy that we're running on is that the knowledge that we collect has to accrue across the whole team and across the health domains at all, and that by having a team that's across all of New Zealand, we gain an additionality in terms of the skills and experience of those people that we couldn't achieve on our own. So the first project, and as it said in the introduction, is really looking at the background literature and existing insights that exist within New Zealand business and our science organisations and universities to provide some early guidance to the science challenge. And amongst those, certainly within the CRIs, there are a number of high-value nutrition aligned projects. And an example of that is one of the projects that I'm going to talk about today to give you a bit of a sense of what is available and what we're able to collect out there. So I imagine that many of the people around in the room today will have been to China and collected insights and done work over there. Certainly at Plant and Food we've been doing that. What we've ended up doing is we've collected taste test data and run some online surveys and done some work in there. And you always get that feeling that whilst that information is really very useful in the product-specific needs that it is, it's still only sort of quite a shallow understanding of those food cultures. And so we decided that what we wanted to do was to go over and start to collect and trying to understand that society in a greater depth. And so we went over and we took our most experienced consumer scientists, ones that had a good sense of what Western and Australasian and American consumer data really said about consumers. We put them in consumers' homes. We went shopping with those consumers. And we had simultaneous translation so that all of those conversations were in real time with real people, so that we could sort of build that. And what I'm going to do is, that's an enormous amount of data to collect and to understand, and we're still going through the analysis of that data. What I'm going to talk about is some of the impressions that I've had from being in those homes that I think will be useful to you people today. We've been to 5 cities. That's going across Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. We've talked to women between the ages of 25 and 45 with and without children, and they represent incomes that would mean that they would be reasonable targets for the New Zealand industries. So let's go through some of the things that we see there. So let's go through the typical sort of places that we went, that we've seen. So you look into those images and you can see these are some of the apartments we walked into. You can see that some of these people have aspirations, they travel well, they're using English words, they have a great sense of where they want to go to. They're living in quite cramped conditions, but you'd go into those places and you wouldn't think that they were going to be that different to perhaps a small New Zealand apartment. You go into their bathrooms and there's exactly the same range of products that you would get in a New Zealand home, the same sort of things that we would aspire to in terms of the things that sit there. Perhaps more interesting is when you go into their kitchens. And the kitchens are pretty small and cramped, and from a New Zealand perspective, if you went back 20, maybe 30 years, you'd think, yes, that was a time when women were put at the back of the house, and the kitchen was a small thing that just the women did their things in, and have obviously changed remarkably. So again, not that different to what we would have had as a society. What you notice is that those Kitchens are used multifunctionally. Some people have their washing machines in there, an enormous cramming of appliances, very product-specific appliances. Again, most of the cooking is done on woks. And we went into those kitchens and we asked women, so what would you like to improve in those kitchens? And many of them said that they would like to have a bigger kitchen, and many of them had actually changed their kitchens around. Some were extraordinarily proud of the size of their kitchens in some of the bigger apartments. Almost all of them had problems with the smells that were created in those environments during cooking and would like a better exhaust or ventilation system to get rid of those smells. We went into one home and we said, so what would you like to, if you could change anything in your kitchen, what would you do? And this woman said to us, she said, well, I'd like to buy an oven, and I'd like to learn how to bake a cake. You know, an aspiration of changing cuisines, changing ways that people will look into the future of what they want to do. The environment that they live in is very different to ours, and this is just a slide of one of the apartment complexes that we went through in Guangzhou, where one of our interviews were. So I'm going to go through some of the accompanied shopping visits that we went through. And, you know, the melamine milk scandal has had a profound change in the consumers in China, and that's perhaps not a surprise. You know, we went shopping with women, and they almost went down those supermarket aisles, and they bought anything but Chinese. When they bought milk, it was milk from Japan, fresh milk from Japan, and foods from Korea. Almost all of those, so there's almost 3 tiers of different places of shopping. So there's a big hypermarkets, many are European sort of brands, but also their own Chinese branded hypermarkets. There's a smaller supermarkets that people would use on a more local sense, but almost every place that we visited within 5 minutes or 10 minutes of those homes was a wet market where there would be multiple stalls that people would go and buy. Often women were saying that they would get up first thing in the morning and they would go and buy their food in the morning for the rest of the day. Freshness was quite important for them. And when they made those decisions around what they were going to actually buy, and which shops they would use, they were very similar that we might do in terms of they looked at the quality and the hygiene of the place, and they looked at whether the stall owner was someone that they felt that they could trust as well. So as you go around those stores, and particularly shopping, one of the things that we very noticed, and it was in the homes as well as connecting with the shopping, was around baked goods. And there was a number of women that were saying, actually, I have a bread maker because I can put the ingredients in that bread maker. It doesn't take long to make that bread, but I would never go out and buy bread from a supermarket. I don't trust that bread. Interestingly, as you went through that in a number of different aisles, people were saying, or women were saying, that, you know, they looked at noodles, and these are dried noodles, and they would say, well, I won't go into some places to buy noodles because I don't know if that has been, you know, if chemicals have been used to make them whiter than they really should be. You went through the aisles of preserved products, and they had a sense that canned food, bottled foods in a jar shouldn't be like that it was used preservatives, and they didn't trust those preservatives, and this was a worry. And clearly what I'm doing is I'm talking about, we never went into those rooms and said we're interested in what you think about New Zealand food. This is all really what they're talking about, their local areas. Most fascinating, certainly for me, was to go and look into people's refrigerators. So you'd open a refrigerator and you'd see a lot of fresh food in there, and you'd see a freezer that was full of frozen food, but the frozen food was food that they had processed themselves and frozen, and you asked them whether they would go and buy a frozen product, and they said no, they wouldn't trust a frozen product. You'd have long conversations with them around snap frozen peas, where your processing technology might give you an ability to provide nutrition that wouldn't deteriorate in the way it would through a fresh supply. So very different senses of things. Also, in terms of frozen, there's, when we got to some of the larger tiers, the bigger cities, then people were saying that they would buy some frozen foods. They would buy frozen dumplings, which they often use for breakfast, but they would only go for very big brands. So they wanted a brand that was big enough that they didn't feel that there was any chance that that company could afford to do anything untoward with that, and therefore they would trust it. There was and I put this slide in, quite a lot of anti-GM responses coming out there, and it's really around where they get their information from. So they were looking, looking towards Europe, seeing things that are coming out in Europe in terms of anti-GM. A lot of people talking about looking for organic food, though they had no idea in terms of the technical definition that we might as food scientists talk about those sorts of products. In terms of information, they were very much influenced by their own networks of friends and family in terms of what they were told. I went down one aisle with a woman who said, those cherry tomatoes, someone told me, a friend of mine told me they're genetically modified. I never buy those. I will never buy them ever. So again, something that a friend said rather than an informed source. They were looking within China, towards more transparent parts of China, like Hong Kong, for their information, and when they could, overseas. And I guess another one, and as we come a bit closer to some of the health-related things, is, we had conversations around how people make decisions. And so we had a conversation with one person that said, she felt that her nutrition was quite good, but her friends told her she should have some supplements with that. And because they all did, she thought that she should be doing that as well. And that's sort of that very, very collective sense. And I think that's not so different. We're all subject to peer pressure ourselves, but perhaps in a way that's a little more. So we went over there, and I guess this is my own personal sense. We went over there thinking that we were going to be looking at the food culture. And what certainly strikes us in my mind is that it was a lot about the food environment and the decisions that consumers would make in that sort of food environment. And of course, that food environment is driven by business culture and government regulations as well as the food culture. And of course, all of those things are underpinned by by societal values, and there are some differences, certainly in some of the Chinese systems of social systems and networks. And as I did that, you look at that data and you actually think of some of the very large European projects that have been looking at the trust in food. And, it's always, and you look at some of them are quite old studies now, or maybe 10 years. You probably shouldn't stereotype, but within Europe, again, you get a range of responses into what people trust and don't trust. So in Italy, people stereotypically think that they trust their local providers, and those are the people that they like to be with and where they like to buy their produce from. Whereas if you go to Germany, they prefer and trust stronger some organizations, and they prefer supermarkets. So again, we're having changes that are perhaps not that different to what we would have in many of our societies. And I focused more on some of the things that struck me, but when Sarah and I went through at the end of the day and sat down and talked about some of the interviews that we've had, We sat and we actually, there were some conversations that we had which we thought were strange, and then we thought, well, actually, I'm not sure that New Zealand consumers wouldn't think the same in many ways in what they trust and don't trust. But I think we have to be aware that it's very much embedded in a local context in all of this sort of stuff. So let's think about some of the things that are perhaps more relevant to high-value nutrition. And the conversations that we had were not about health and nutrition. We had conversations that were saying, so what are you changing in terms of the foods that you eat? How do you make a decision about what you're going to cook? And there were a number of those consumers that were saying things like, well, and they're living in 3 generations, so there's the child, the mother, and the grandparents in the same home. And they were saying, I'm very worried about my parents, and they talk about the big 4, high blood pressure, high blood fat, high blood sugar, and that they want their parents to have a healthier diet, and they're reducing the amount of meat that these people eat, and they're reducing the amount of oils that they use in cooking to reflect that. But they do it in a context and a language that is very different to what we would do. And so they talk about they're moving their parents to a more cooling diet. And of course, when we talk about heating and cooling foods, this is reflecting the sort of the sense of yang and yin. And the sense that everything has to be in balance. And they were moving the balance more to a more cooling one rather than just simply removing fats from their diet. So what are some of those products? So quite often, and it wasn't unusual to go in, so the sense of balance changes almost how you interpret food at all. So on people's fridges, you would have an example which showed pairs of foods that were good and pairs of foods that were bad, and the same food will be on both sides of the line, but it's the combination that it's with which makes it good or bad. For me, and certainly coming from a horticultural organisation, my people that I talk to are completely dumbfounded that you get fruit on a good side and a bad side. In some balance. And of course, in Malaysia, then, if you eat a durian, which is quite a heaty food, then you would also eat with that a mangosteen that was a more cooling fruit. So you'd have 2 fruit to create a level of balance. And of course, these contexts actually, aren't defined as strongly as it looks in that slide, because there are regional differences in terms of how you would define those foods, and an individual in terms of how they know their own body responds to those foods will be slightly different. So clearly, this sense of heaty and cooling, or yang and yin in terms of foods, has a big implication not only on health but on emotion as well. And one of the things that struck us most was quite, seen to us almost outrageous, was you'd go into those homes and there was no paracetamol there at all. So if they were feeling sick and had a headache or the start of a cold, they would describe that as their bodies being out of balance, and they would look towards maybe a herbal response to that. And here's just some examples, just from a domestic airport, in terms of the sense of how people can look at blood pressure, liver, and different herbal teas in terms of how you're going to correct some of those things. So maybe as a conclusion, and it probably, and I guess condensing an awful lot of data down into a very small period of time, sometimes your conclusions don't necessarily seem like the things that you've talked about. And that's a quote that I have up there from one of our focus groups. And interestingly, in terms of food and health, meaning that you won't have to go to a doctor who's quite expensive, is something that actually also crops up in Singapore amongst Chinese as well. So in all of those conversations when we talk to consumers, health was one of the most important features of reasons for choosing foods. They have very rich traditional wisdom, but that's been modified with new trends and all the information that comes through TV shows and a whole range, a lot of interest, all of the stuff on their own internet. I think what it means for high-value nutrition is we need to think of how we communicate the information that we're providing to them. And I think that there are some very good examples in New Zealand industry of strategies of actually how you go out and encourage or get consumers to understand the issues that they're facing and convince them to make some of those changes. But I think overall, we need to be very aware of that overall food environment of certainly in China. Thank you.